Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski, managing editor at the Cipher Brief. Thanks for joining us again. We are here today to talk about, we've said it before, but some maybe larger, more realistic rays of hope in the Middle East and in Gaza in particular than we've had in some time. Great to have with us Ambassador Gary Grappo, Cipher Brief expert. And Gary, I'm particularly happy that you're with us and that we're having this conversation because so often you and I talk about things where there aren't any rays of hope to be seen anywhere. And I suppose just to start with, before we get into some specifics, we've heard it, as I said, we've heard it before. We now have, however, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, among others, his words were distinct possibility that we're going to have a deal this week. How would you assess your own hopefulness or lack thereof at this moment?
Well, first of all, thank you, Tom, for inviting me to join, and Happy New Year to yourself and all the folks at Cipher Brief and listeners as well. So, um, I think there's somewhat more reason for optimism today than previously, but again, I would caution it's very guarded. Certainly, in my case, there
Mm-hmm.
are lots of reasons to argue that nothing is going to happen between now and next week when Mr. Trump takes office. But I was never particularly good gazing into a crystal ball when I was an actively serving diplomat. And I don't think those skills have improved much since then. But I will say the prospects seem somewhat better, certainly given a stream of comments having been made by senior members of the administration, including, as you said, Jake Sullivan and earlier Antony Blinken, Secretary of
Right.
State. Having said all that, there are lots of reasons that this could go south. And I think the first is the resistance on the part of the Hamas leadership to agree to the current conditions as we understand them to a ceasefire, which would only be temporary,
Mm-hmm.
something on the order of 60 days, perhaps more, but nevertheless only temporary. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. They need a permanent ceasefire to survive and to rebuild. So for Hamas, these negotiations are in fact existential. That is not the case for Israel. Although the war in Gaza is extremely costly for Israel in terms of manpower and funds expended, um, they still enjoy the support. The Israeli leadership, enjoy the support of the Israeli public in pursuing this war to the ends that everyone would like to see in Israel. And so the advantage is clearly, undoubtedly, on the side of Israel, not only in the war itself, but in these negotiations. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's all the reason for Israel to hold its line for a temporary ceasefire as opposed to permanent. And that's what I believe is blocking Hamas at the moment in agreeing to it.
Where are the rays coming from then? Because that issue has been around since this started. Netanyahu said this weekend it's got to be partial. As you say, Hamas has said it needs to be longer term. I thought that had been that issue had been narrowed to some extent, or are there other areas that have produced the hope that we're hearing about?
I think most of the other issues have been addressed, including Israeli forces, for example, remaining in certain
Mhm.
areas of Gaza and certain restrictions on the security around the access points to Gaza. Most of those have been resolved or have been relegated to relatively minor importance today. In my view, I think the major sticking point is how long this will be. And, um, and that's an existential question for the Hamas leadership. And I also suspect that there's a fair amount of disagreement between the Gaza based faction
Mhm.
and those outside of Gaza who are probably driving for uh, a ceasefire under whatever conditions they can get at this point. One final point I want to mention here, Tom, and that is that there is a deadline, and the deadline, of course, is next week, and the transfer of power here in the United States from President Joe Biden to President to be Donald Trump, who will probably give Israel, in fact, not probably, most definitely give Israel far more leeway in how it may wish to pursue this war in its many, many aspects beyond how Mr. Biden may have approached it.
A couple of questions then, just to follow up a little bit. First of all, on the fate of the hostages, is that not producing? I mean, it has at a low level, I suppose, throughout any more pressure on Netanyahu and the government of Israel. I mean, if this list came out or Hamas offered up a list, has that does that have no bearing in terms of the political situation and pressure on the Israelis to come to a deal?
No, certainly from the Israeli perspective, the domestic perspective, it has a great deal of bearing, and it would appear that they've made substantial progress. Whether they have been able to resolve all the issues is uncertain. From Israel's perspective, it wants this issue completely resolved, or
Hmm.
in the event of a temporary ceasefire, a specific timeline for the release of all hostages, including the remains of those who died while in captivity. And I suspect there will be a specific timeline for that
Right.
and a rigid condition in the sense that no release means a resumption of the war.
Yeah.
And so this is another added point, pressure point. Um, I have not heard much discussion on release of Palestinian prisoners by Israel.
Hmm.
So I really can't speak authoritatively on where that might stand. Hamas obviously would like to see significant numbers and also specific personnel
Hmm.
included in the first tranche of prisoner release by the Israelis.
Right. Now, you mentioned the transfer of power in this country in a few days' time, and one scenario that Trump is perhaps, although the Biden administration, you could argue, has given Israel a pretty free hand as it is, but yes, might be even more so. And Trump is a great friend of the Israelis, and they like him and all the rest. But is there not also I guess it's nothing more than a school of thought that because President-elect Trump has such a strong relationship with the Israeli leader, he might be better placed to push him and exert some pressure on him to bring this to an end.
I don't think there's any question that Donald Trump wants to see this war ended and ended soon.
Hmm.
Um, Probably better for him if it occurs on his watch, and he can claim the credit. And in that sense, maybe Bibi is looking to do him a favor
Hmm.
for a return, and that's the way Donald Trump works. You do him a favor, and he does you a favor. So that clearly is a factor in all of this. I don't know the extent to which Hamas would be aware and would be considering
Right.
this. I think from Hamas's perspective is that there will be less pressure on Bibi
Hmm.
from the United States to act, and other than to see an eventual end to the war. But the conditions for that, I think, will be largely up to the Israelis without a great deal of American pressure. So that's where I think Hamas is looking at this, and it's Hamas still that is under the gun to try and deliver something for the people of Gaza while also attempting to ensure its permanence in Gaza to the extent that it is at the moment.
Right. So, last question then, which is whenever the war is going to end at some point, I think it's fair to say it may be in Jake Sullivan's formulation, there's a ceasefire this week, or it may be a long way from now. Could you talk a little bit, Ambassador Grappo, about what, other than I would imagine a big infusion of humanitarian aid and the obvious benefit of the end of hostilities, what other benefits will accrue to the region uh, in the event and when the guns go silent and a ceasefire, a permanent one, does get put into place in Gaza?
Well, this will obviously moot a lot of the criticism directed toward Israel, both from within the region and internationally, as the ceasefire goes into effect and as greater amounts of aid are able to enter Gaza. And by the way, part of that ceasefire must include some of the parameters with respect to aid deliveries, how they will be managed, and how they will address the security around the deliveries, because that right now is a major factor, a major challenge to
Hmm.
delivering humanitarian aid. So all of that will have to be sorted out. I think a lot of Arab countries, the UAE has already spoken publicly about it, want to participate in that and play a role in that. Um, and To the extent that more of the aid can flow and ameliorate this humanitarian crisis, the more it will diminish the pressure on Israel, and the attention of people in the Middle East will be focused on elsewhere, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's
Hmm.
Syria, or the big problem, and that is the conflict between Iran and Israel.
Yeah. Well, here's to hoping, right? And thank you again, Ambassador Gary Grappo. It's always great to have you with us. Appreciate your insights, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, Tom. Good to see you.